things. Hold on 1 second here. I'd like to just say a couple opening words. We have an exciting program with Brian Collins from a former Walt Disney Imagineer. Just some housekeeping before we get started. Obviously, we are going to mute the room. We are live streaming this as well, so I just request that you are using your AltSpace etiquette. And more than anything, we're going to use the emoji feature to express our support, and we're going to all laugh at Brian's jokes when he tells them to make sure that he feels good about it. But ultimately, if this is your first event inside AltSpace, please, we want to welcome you to Brian's meeting of your WDI DNA. So just to give an introduction, Brian began his Walt Disney career as an Imagineer, where he helped create the magic for Disney's Florida theme parks, before going on to produce work for a number of corporations and small entrepreneurial ventures. He was providing video production and creative services and support. Along the way, he became a passionate educator, serving as an adjunct professor at several schools here in Central Florida, and also was an innovation specialist for online education and what would later become the Florida Virtual School. He has developed a deep understanding of new and emerging technologies, and most importantly, how they apply to business, the military, and learning environments. Brian is a highly sought after innovation consultant through his practice known as the Brainstorm Institute, where he combines design thinking skills and technology know-how with a strategic business acumen in order to design, plan, and execute experiences for his clients. As a senior director of innovation and strategic innovations for Magic Bytes, one of Orlando's many XR studios here in this robust simulation ecosystem, his focus is to make sure the company leverages the latest and most relevant game theory and design technologies available. An accomplished speaker, Brian is often interviewed on podcasts and is available to deliver keynote addresses, lectures, and workshops or other corporate or conference events. This is Brian's first presentation in virtual reality, and he is looking forward to many, many more. So let's all give Brian a warm welcome and let's put those emojis up in the air. Thanks a lot, Brian.
Hey, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thank you, guys. Thank you. So how many of you guys have ever been to a presentation, a virtual presentation before? A few of you guys. I'm sure for a lot of you, this is the first one, and it's probably not going to be your last. I think you're going to be seeing more and more presentations being done in the virtual world. So again, I want to thank Steve and the folks at Slupiter for helping me put this all together. Appreciate that very much. Thank you. Thumbs up. And he gave you a nice little background. How many of you guys have ever been to Disney before? Let me see. Yeah, probably pretty much everyone has been to Disney. So as he said, I was very, very fortunate to work there in Imagineering. And when I worked in Imagineering, my primary focus there was to work as a show writer. So when you work as a show writer, as an Imagineer, you're not writing shows per se, but you're writing for the overall Disney show. So I got to write stuff for like the Jungle Cruise and the Great Movie Ride and all the Epcot World Showcases. It was a lot of fun. And one of the things that I started to take away from that was I started thinking about, what is it that makes me a creative individual? If I were to ask you guys to raise your hand or give me some emojis, if I were to ask how many of you guys would consider yourselves to be creative, let me see how many of you in the room would say you're creative. Most people, I think, do tend to recognize that they've got some sense of creativity. And when we work as Imagineers, it's not that we're any more necessarily creative than anyone else that's out there in the room or on the street, but there are certain techniques that we tend to, I think, develop early on in our careers that kind of help us manifest that creativity in a lot of ways. One of the things that I've over the years talked to a lot of my students and my clients about is something that I refer to as your WDI DNA, right? Your DNA that's inside every one of us. And I picked that term very specifically, DNA, because I do believe that creativity is something that's very inherent in every one of us. It's something that we all very naturally have and can all tap into. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to go through and talk about the 5 components of what makes up your WDI DNA. So we'll start with the first one. And the first component of your WDI DNA is passion. I think the most innovative, the most creative people tend to be very passionate people. They not only are they very passionate about the projects that they work on. When I was doing the Great Movie Ride, I was asked to plus the script in there. I was, working on the staging that goes on in that particular attraction. And, when you put that much of yourself into a project, you're going to become very, very passionate about it. But that passion, I think, also kind of bleeds out into another area for us. When we say we're passionate, one of the ways that passion translates is by giving us the ability to make sure we get something done. If we set a goal and it's important to us, whether it's a goal at work, at home, an athletic goal, a personal goal, a diet, whatever it may be, we tend to see it through. Creative people, innovative people tend to see those things that are important to them through. And that really does help drive that creativity and that innovation. So passion is the first one. The second component of your DNA, something that I refer to as intuition, okay? We all know what intuition is. Another way of talking about intuition is having a gut feeling, a sense that you know something is right. You've got this idea kind of percolating around in your head. You know it's right. You don't exactly know why it's right, but you just have that gut feeling, that intuition that it's the right idea. And I would say that the most creative people out there, the people, your Elon Musks, your Steve Jobs, certainly your Walt Disneys, tend to really have a lot of that intuition, those gut feelings. They get these ideas, and a lot of times people will try and, kind of beat those ideas down. Oh, that's a stupid idea, crazy idea. What we call those voices of reason out there will go ahead and people will give us all kinds of ideas and reasons in their perception of why it's a bad idea. But again, the most innovative, creative people have this gut feeling that they know something is going to be right. They have a deep sense of intuition. Number three is inclusiveness. Inclusiveness. By inclusiveness, I'm talking about being accepting of other people's ideas, other people's ways of thinking. How many of you guys ever heard of Frank Zappa out there, right? He's kind of like an old-time rock guy, hippie rock star, right? Frank Zappa. And Frank had Zappa had one of my favorite quotes out there. He said, a mind is like a parachute. It doesn't work unless it's open. And I think that's very, very important to us. If we're going to be trying to come up with innovations, trying to transform, trying to really kind of push the boundaries, you've got to be open to other people's point of views. You've got to be open to other ways of thinking. Super, super important. Inclusiveness, very, very, very important. If you've ever been in a brainstorming session, say at work, what's one of the first rules that they give you when you're brainstorming? No idea is a bad idea, right? No idea is a bad idea. And the reason they do that is when you're brainstorming, when you're trying to innovate, you don't want to be saying no to anything, because as crazy and absurd as an idea may sound at the time, you never know when that may come back to serve you well, okay? And you might be able to take a bit of one person's idea, another idea, looking at it from maybe a different cultural lens. There's so many different ways and perspectives of taking an idea, massaging it, and looking at it through. So in inclusion, let's talk about number 4. Number 4 is going to be curiosity. Okay. Again, the most innovative people, I think, have got a really highly defined sense of curiosity. What I call the Peter Pan effect, right? Peter Pan's the kid that never wanted to grow up. My poor kids, I'm telling you, they get a dad like me, never want to grow up. And I would say that's not necessarily a bad thing. I would say that, again, the most highly creative people, you want to always kind of have a children's perspective of the world. I remember one time I was taking a trip up to Boston one time, living in Florida. All three of my kids, they're in their 20s now at this point. 2 of them still have never seen snow. But my daughter at the time, when she was younger, I remember I was taking this trip to Boston and she came up to me before I left and she's like, Dad, you're going on an airplane up north. I say, yeah. She says, it's snowing up there. I say, yeah, probably is snowing up there. And then she looked at me and she asked me a question. She said, Dad, how come the snow is white? Why is the snow white? I mean, I'm sure as a dad, I was able to come up with some kind of foolproof answer like dads usually can do that sounded very good. I have no idea why the snow is white, but I'm trying to make something up. But that's the kind of question that's going to come from a kid, right? Why is it snow white? And I would challenge all of you guys to always kind of have that same kind of curiosity and ask those same kind of questions. Ask, there's a comedian used to be very popular out there named Stephen Wright, who would ask wonderful questions about, and give very rhetorical kind of questions out there, like if at first you don't succeed, then skydiving isn't for you, stuff like that. And I think it's very, very important to always kind of, again, kind of put those kids' glasses on and look at the world through that perspective. Because, kids are always going to look at things from a very, very different point of view. Don't grow up. It's my favorite, one of my favorite singers, Jimmy Buffett, says, want to grow older, but not up, right? And that's me. That's kind of how I feel while I'm doing. The last component of your DNA, the 5th component, that's going to be emotion. Now, when I talk about emotion, what I'm saying here is that I think innovative people, creative people tend to wear their emotions on their sleeves. They're not scared to necessarily show their emotion. And I would put to you that that's not a bad thing. I think, we've all heard about these tortured creative souls out there, people, like the artist who cut off his ear, right, and sent it to his fiance, Van Gogh, I think it was, and people like that, Picasso, all these. And I'm not saying you have to really kind of go to that state, okay? I'm not saying you have to be tortured, to be creative. But I think it's a good thing to not let your emotions hold you back and not be scared to put your emotion into your work. So emotion, that would be the last component of your DNA. And probably as my friend Goofy here, would say, I want to give you something to think about. And that is that by focusing on your WDI DNA, right? By looking at understanding what those 5 components are, understanding what makes you tick as a creative person, then at that point, that's when you can go ahead and really kind of start making profound changes, not only to your work, not only to your home, your personal life, but to your bigger life in general. I think understanding, what those 5 components of your WDI DNA are, knowing how they all kind of come together to work, that's when you can really start seeing some incredible progression in your own innovation and your own creativity. I want to take a second before I wrap up, and I want to tell you some stories here. I've got 3 stories for you, and these come from when I was working at Disney in Imagineering. And then I want to kind of tell you the lessons that I was able to kind of take away from them. And this will kind of give you some real world examples of how your WDI DNA can work for you. The first of these is going to be from the Haunted Mansion. Now, the Haunted Mansion has got a wonderful, rich history to it. One of my favorite attractions out there. And one of the things about the Haunted Mansion is that it was a difficult ride, to be honest, to engineer and to bring together. And one of the most difficult challenges that the Imagineers had when they were creating the Haunted Mansion was for the ride vehicles. Now, the ride vehicles, they're known as dune buggies, not dune, D-U-N-E, but doom, D-O-O-M, dune buggies, right? And there's a really interesting story of how those dune buggies came to be. At one point, John Hench, who was one of the master planners for the mansion, and Bob Gurr, another legendary Imagineer, they were having a meeting and they were discussing some of the challenges with the Haunted Mansion. And specifically at one point, they were talking about the ride vehicles. And one of the challenges they were having with the ride vehicle is that they knew that as people were kind of making their way through the Haunted Mansion, they wanted to be able to kind of focus their attention and their point of view on specific areas for the ride. So, when you went by the library, when you went, down into the seance room and you saw the ballroom dancers, and then you went down into the cemetery, they wanted to be able to kind of focus your attention very specifically. And they needed a ride vehicle that would do that. And now they weren't getting anywhere. So out of frustration at one point, John picked up an apple that was sitting on his desk and he took a bite out of it and he held it up and he said, "This is what I want the ride vehicle to look like." And if you kind of look at those dune buggies, you kind of can see that that's almost what they look like. It's like an apple with a bite taken out of it. And that solved the problem right there of being able to focus that point of view. Because if you've ever ridden in the Haunted Mansion and you've gone in there, you know that how they go through the attraction, but they turn and they point you in very specific directions. You may not have even thought about it or noticed it, but it's a very, very conscious decision. And the lesson from this first story is that sometimes if you're having trouble thinking about an idea, having an idea come to you, sometimes the best thing to do is to just kind of chill out and relax and maybe go take a walk, maybe, go listen to some music. And then when you're thinking about it, that's usually when those breakthrough ideas come, right? I've got this picture up here of Hamlet. How many of you guys know the story of Hamlet, right? The young Danish prince had a tough life, right? Hamlet's uncle murdered his father, right? And then the uncle goes ahead and marries Hamlet's mom, something rotten in the state of Denmark, right? So Hamlet's having a very tough time dealing with all this, obviously. On top of everything else, he starts seeing his father's ghost wandering around the castle. And at one point in the play, the young prince gets up and he gives the famous "to be or not to be" speech. And a lot of people don't know it, but there's actually an answer for that question, to be or not to be. It's not really kind of said within the play itself, but if you're a Shakespearean scholar, you kind of, come to learn these things. And the answer of to be or not to be is just be. And that's what Hamlet does. He decides to just be. He decides that he's not going to take any action, that he's just going to kind of not forget about, but just kind of not focus on it, and eventually have the confidence that that answer will reveal itself. And that would be probably one of the biggest bits of advice I could give you guys. If you're struggling with an issue, whether, it's at work, at home, whatever it may be, sometimes you need to just kind of take a break, and that's okay. Step away. Take some time to just kind of let things percolate up here, let them just kind of work themselves out. And eventually that answer is probably going to come to you. Second story I wanted to talk to you guys about has to do with the Great Movie Ride. I mentioned that I got to work in the Great Movie Ride. And one of the things that I did for the Great Movie Ride is I got to plus the script. It was a lot of fun. Now, if you've never been on the Great Movie Ride, just to kind of give you a quick overview of how that attraction works. When you would get into these cars, you would ride through movie sets with Disney audio animatronic figures from some of your favorite films, classic films. So you would see a scene from Singing in the Rain, or Mary Poppins, or Alien, or Casablanca, The Wizard of Oz. And at one point, as you're going through the attraction in your cars, you come to either old alleyway, like in the heart of Chicago, like a big city alleyway, or you come to a Western scene. And depending on which car you're in, you either get your ride vehicle either gets hijacked by a gangster or by a Western bandit. And then they take over for the tour guide, and they take you through the attraction for a period. It was really a lot of fun. But after a couple years or so of running the Great Movie Ride, we understood that there were some areas that kind of needed to be plussed, some areas where we needed to really kind of improve some of the scripting and the dialogue and all of that. And one of the things I did to kind of help our cast members do that was I went in, and if you look at the screen, you'll see that we put up a backstory for the gangster and the bandit. I wrote these really elaborate backstories. This wasn't anything that the guests ever saw. So, for example, the gangster, his backstory talked about how he used to run liquor for Al Capone, and as a teenager would like scam tourists and be a pickpocket. And the same thing for the bandit, grew up on the wrong side of the law, and, was spending his evenings around the campfire with some of the roughest and toughest characters in the Wild West. And again, there was even a character profile for the tour guide, because your tour guide actually was a character too, right? So I wrote these really elaborate backstories for them. And the reason I did that is because, you could have any of a number of people playing those different roles, right? Stepping into the role of the gangster, the bandit. And it was really important that they understood who these characters were, so that no matter who played it, they had at least a sense of consistency between them, and they could deliver a good show based on who those characters were. Super important. I remember reading an article, was really kind of fascinating, about the making of Wonder Woman, a really cool movie that came out a few years ago. And there's a scene in Wonder Woman where they're in England, and they're watching the soldiers come back from Dunkirk, right? from that famous battle in Dunkirk. And Wonder Woman is in there watching it, and all the soldiers are coming off the ships and everything. And I remember reading this article that talked about how the costume designer had actually created a little packet of materials for every single extra. And there were probably well over 100 extras that were in that scene. Each one of those movie extras got a little pouch, and inside of it was like a little collection of things for that individual soldier, who he was. So it was maybe a letter from home from his wife. It was maybe a little curio that he had carried with him. Now, if you think about it, it's really extraordinary because, a scene like that only lasted maybe a few minutes. Those extras were way in the background. They certainly weren't the focus of it, but the costume director knew how important it was for them to be able to kind of visualize what they were doing, why they were there. So very much like, the same reason that I wrote those backstories for my characters, it's so important to be able to understand that. The lesson from this story is that actually story is king. Now, we don't do anything at Disney. If you've ever watched, if you've seen recently on Disney Plus, the special on Imagineering, you heard them talk about this, and in different articles, you probably have heard this as well. But at Disney, we don't really do anything in Imagineering without having a story created. And that's so important. And whether it's, us working on an attraction or you guys working on a project, if it's in a engineer, trying to design a new piece of equipment, if it's a doctor working on a new kind of surgery, if it's whatever it may be, very important to try and frame it in the arc of a story. Because what that does is it kind of gives you a beginning and an end. It gives you an overall, and more important than that, it gives your entire team a way to kind of focus and frame whatever that project may be. So story is king, and you hear about storytelling quite a bit these days. It's becoming very much in vogue, if you will. By being able to look around and pick out different parts of a project and associate them with what the overall story arc is. Corporate storytelling is becoming very, very important. And as we start becoming more immersed in environments like this, in VR worlds, it's going to be even more important. So story is king. The last story I want to talk about has to do with the Forest of Endor. So we opened up Star Tours at the Disney MGM Studios, now Disney Hollywood Studios. But in front of our Star Tours attraction, we created this wonderful reproduction of the Forest of Endor. And it was filled with these trees. And all of these trees were made out of concrete, and they actually hid on the backside of them. They were actually hiding some steel framework and lighting rigs for show lights in the evening and things like that. But one day I'm sitting there at my desk, and my boss comes up to me, and he says, "Brian, I got a job for you." And I always knew it was going to be something interesting when he came up to my desk and said something like that. And said, "Brian, we got a job for you." So, our Forest of Endor? He said, "Here's what I want you to do. What I'd like you to do is write me some little plaques that describe what the names of those trees are and what they are." So if you guys have ever been to maybe a zoo, or a botanical garden or a museum, you know what I'm talking about. Those little plaques that have the scientific name of whatever the plant may be and, the description of it. So he's like, "Brian, I want you to write me scientific plaques for our trees from the Forest of Endor." And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? Well, so I thought about it, and I did some research. I went out, I looked at some real plaques just to kind of get a sense of, what was even on them. And usually there was the Latin name, the English name, and a little description. And the plaque that I came up with, basically what I came up with, the Latin name was Sequoia pseudonym, which is fake sequoia. And basically, the English name was hollowback sequoia because they were hollowed out trees, right? And basically, the description was these trees have an unusually thick bark. They need very low maintenance and watering. Well, of course, because they're all made from concrete and steel. So, just kind of having fun with that. But the lesson, the reason I wanted to tell that little story is because it's really important, I think, especially for creative people, to fill up your mental filing cabinets, what I call your mental filing cabinets. I think the most creative people out there happen to be very observant, right? Right? Looking at me. So basically what we're able to do is to walk around and be students of the world, to observe things, to hear things, to smell things, to just experience things. In Aikido, the martial art of Aikido, there's a term that's called soft eyes. And basically what soft eyes means is being observant but not focused. So when you walk into this room, for example, you didn't necessarily have to, that these two tables are right here up front, but you probably didn't have to walk in and stare at them and burn the image of those tables into your brain to know that they were there. You're just they're there, they're observing, you kind of noticed it. And I think the most creative people, that's really highly skilled talent that's really important to master. So you come in and you might be looking at the wood flooring here. You might be looking at the fireflies outside. You might be hearing a piece of music as you're out and about. You might get a smell, any of those things. And then you just kind of take those and you kind of lock them away in this mental filing cabinet that we have. Not knowing when you're going to use it, but just knowing sometime you are going to need it. It's kind of like, I think we all tend to be like physical pack rats too, right? If you're really creative, you probably don't have like the cleanest desk in the office, right? You probably don't have the cleanest house. I know my wife is always, clean up, put your dishes away kind of thing, right? My garage, raising 3 kids is filled with all kinds of crap. I mean, I've got all kinds of little electrical lights and things that make sounds. And like I said, my kids are in their 20s now, and I've got stuff in there since they were young. And I just couldn't bear to throw it away because you push a button and it lights up or something. And I'm like, I don't know why I'm keeping it, but I just know that someday it's going to come back to serve me well. And what happens as soon as you go to throw it out? That's when you need it, right? Exactly. As soon as you toss it, that's when you need it. So very, very important, I think, to not only are we physical pack rats like that, but I think it's super, super important to be mental pack rats as well. Let's fill up your mental filing cabinet. Kind of brings me to the last question I'm going to talk about here before I wrap up. And this is a question that I get asked quite a bit, and it is basically, what would Walt do, right? WWWD. What would Walt do? And I want to tell you guys one last story here that kind of exemplifies why Walt was so respected for his creativity and his innovation. Now, when Disneyland first opened up, if you've ever read about the history of Disneyland, you know that it wasn't the smoothest grand opening ever. There were a lot of issues and problems, and hopefully a lot of the people, never kind of realized it or saw it, but there were all kinds of things, I mean, it was a very expensive project. It was a very complex project, and, it was a very expensive project. So getting Disneyland open was a real challenge. And, Walt was very hands-on, very involved with the construction and the building of Disneyland. And he would often go out and kind of walk through the park as the park was being built. And a couple weeks, this is a true story, a couple weeks before Disneyland was set to open up, he was doing one of his walkthroughs, and he went up to his head landscaper at the time, just to kind of check in and see how things were going, and the landscaper was a little bit upset, a little bit distraught because, he said to Walt, there's so much left to do. I really don't think we're going to get every single thing done. I mean, we're prioritizing as best as we can, Walt, but I just don't think we're going to get every single thing done. And Walt, instead of saying, I don't care what it takes, you find a way to get it done. We've all had bosses like that, right? But Walt's approach was quite a bit different. What Walt did was he said, I want you to come over here. Tell me a little bit. Show me something maybe that you're not going to have finished. So the landscaper took Walt over to a small little flower bed, and he said, we've got hundreds of these flower beds throughout the park. The main ones, we're going to have those done, no problem. But a lot of these smaller ones like this here, we're just not going to be able to get it done. So Walt stopped and he thought for a second. He's like, I said, here's what I want you to do. And he told the landscaper, he said, I want you to pick one of your smartest guys out there, and I want you to send him to the library, and I want to research what these different so-called weeds are in this particular planter. And then what I want you to do is make up some little signs, just like I did for my forests of indoor trees. I want you to make up some of those little scientific signs and put those in the flower beds that you're not going to have finished. And that's exactly what they did. And sure enough, on opening day, when people came in and they walked through the park, they saw these beautiful flower beds, and they didn't see one that was uncompleted and one that was filled with weeds. But instead, what they saw were all these flower beds that were filled with all these cool, exotic plants. I mean, they had these, scientific names and a plaque for them, right? So that's a great example of what would Walt do. What would Walt do? And my challenge to you guys would be the same thing, to maybe stop and take a minute if you're at a tough crossroad. Think about what makes up that creative DNA, and then stop and think, what would Walt do? What would Walt do? And that's the end of my presentation, guys. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I've got my information up here. I would love for you guys certainly to, track me down and find me and stay in touch. I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn. Connect with me there. I usually get a zillion friend requests here in VR space, and I'm happy to take those. But more than that, I would love you to follow me. It's even better to just follow me on social media. Email me, visit my website. If anyone needs, I'll give a shameless plug for Magic Bites. But if anyone needs any content creation out there, would love to talk to you about that. I'd love to go on podcasts and certainly do more of these presentations. And thank you very much.
All right,
Thank
guys,
you.
what do you think? Let's get some applause for Brian. I think he did pretty good for his first presentation in virtual reality. Don't you agree?
Thank you.
Thank you all so
Thank you.
much. We do have some
Thank
time for question and answers, so I'm going to go ahead and turn on the Q&A part. If you are not familiar with how to do that, in just a minute here, you're going to see a little button that pops up that allows you to raise your hand. If you go ahead and click that button, not the emoji hand, but click the one that says raise hand, it'll give you an opportunity to ask a question. So we'll give everyone a moment to get acclimated there. But I do have a question for Brian. What I'd like to know, Brian, is where do you see the future of technology and virtual reality and distance learning sort of merge together in the next, we'll say 12 to 24 months? Where do you see that happening? What do you see happening in that space?
I definitely see an acceleration of it. If I were to go around and ask people that were here, how many of them had ever been in a virtual world or thought about being in a virtual world before the pandemic, I would bet a lot of them had not. I think, just the times right now have dictated the acceleration of that technology. And I think you're going to be seeing it a lot more for social purposes. I certainly think environments like this are going to be the next evolution of maybe like what Facebook is now. I think you're going to be seeing more meetings and more educational classrooms and more trainings. All of that's going to take place. I think to some extent, the technology, it's still young technology. So I think the technology is going to have to catch up to some extent, but we're getting there very, very quickly. And there are a lot of very smart people out there working on this. So I think,
cool.
It's here to stay.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience, and I certainly want to encourage anybody that has a question, go ahead and click that raise hand button. But we're going to go to DJ Smith. I'm going to turn you on air and megaphone.
Hey,
you
DJ.
should be with us, DJ.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation.
Thank you, appreciate it.
So I'm kind of curious on your thoughts of augmented versus virtual reality in the amusement world, location-based. I think that, historically, I think people have always said that Disney has kind of avoided that because they're so focused on the social aspect, but obviously social, it can be done in VR. So I don't know what the exact question is, but would love your thoughts.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and one that I'm starting to get asked quite a bit is basically how is XR, which is kind of like the umbrella term for all of this, going to impact the theme park experience? And again, I think you're going to be seeing it impacted for sure. Now, when virtual reality first came out, it was really the darling of a lot of designers out there, and everyone was kind of jumping on the bandwagon. And at one point, they were starting to use it just for the sake of using it, not without regard to what the bigger story was that I talked about. There were times where they would put people on a roller coaster and give them VR goggles and send them through, and it was kind of a novel idea, but I think kind of maybe a little bit misguided as well. So I think as the technology evolves, you mentioned augmented reality. I think that's probably going to have a little bit more of a place in the theme parks. Where it gets tricky, though, is because you still need the hardware, right? You need the glasses or the goggles, and that's going to make it a little bit challenging. But I absolutely do see more immersive environments coming. And I think as the technology begins to evolve, you'll find some really kind of fun, creative ways that XR, whether it's augmented or virtual, is going to be used. If not for the attractions themselves, and certainly to complement the experience, I've seen some really cool stuff where you can like hold your phone up and get like navigation cues on how to make your way through different cities. And I can see that happening for theme parks, so stuff like that, I think you'll be seeing a lot more.
Great. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Thank you, DJ. Great question. We have another question from Brian. So I'm going to go ahead and switch this over to Brian in a moment here. Brian, you should be on air. If you want to go ahead and say hello to Brian Collins. Brian, you may need to either unmute yourself or click the megaphone on your menu. Looks like Brian may have dropped off. So, but anyway,
Okay.
that's okay. Oh, he's coming back. All right, let's try this one more time. Brian, can you throw emoji up in the air and see, just so we can kind of figure out where in the room you are? There you are. Okay,
Oh,
yeah, over
there we
there.
go.
Yeah, so we see you. You should be able to turn on your megaphone by unmuting your microphone. It's right above the alt space menu.
I love the red and black.
Looks
That's
like,
my
it looks like we
college,
have an audio challenge here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move to the next question, and then if we get a chance, we'll come back to Brian if he's able to figure out his audio. So we have Niblet that is going to ask Brian a question. Niblet, you are on air. Hi, Niblet. If you want to turn on your microphone, you can do that by activating the. Yes,
Oh.
we've got you now. Yes. Yes.
I think I'm straddling the window here. This is my first time in here.
Oh, there you are.
Oh,
in
we
the
see you
green.
over there. Yeah, great. Well, nice to see you.
That's really cool.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. This is fantastic. I love this. Brian, are you still working with Disney?
Not for them, but I've got like a dotted line relationship back to them. So, and have pretty much all my career. So, yeah.
This is fascinating.
Very-
Yes, I look forward to following this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I
Well, thank
appreciate you
you.
coming out. Thanks.
Niblet, let me ask
I
you a
love your
question.
magic power.
Yeah. Is this the first time that you've been to a presentation in AltSpace VR, Niblet?
Yes, this is my first time even being in alt space. So I have a lot of
Well, welcome. Let's give Niblet some love right now, and just to welcome her to our community. You are in a room of, yeah. Are you in virtual reality? It looks like maybe you're using an Oculus Go.
No,
No?
I'm not. Actually, I would love to know what you think I might get for a,
Yeah.
like a headset or something, or is it worth doing that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I would recommend anybody that, is enjoying our presentation today, and it's your first time ever being inside AltSpace. But you're doing it from a two-dimensional standpoint. There are a number of entry point devices that can get you in here in virtual reality with us. The Oculus Go clearly is the easiest one. And then the complexity of the Oculus Quest and some of the other tethered machines certainly changed the way the immersion works. But thank you again for joining us, Niblet. It looks like Brian is back on, so we're gonna see if we can get reconnected to Brian.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can you hear me this time?
I
Oh, yeah,
can
we
hear
hear
you.
Oh, yay. Okay. Thank you, Brian, for your presentation. I said it real quick.
Thank you.
I'm in Los
Sure.
Angeles, the film industry. I have a
Nice,
project I'm trying to get out to Blumhouse actually at the moment, but it's
Oh, nice.
something once I got into this, I started to consider the idea of simultaneously, like shooting our movie as one would shoot a movie. Then I thought,
Yeah.
wouldn't it be cool to do the same thing in VR? And then I had the same
Yeah.
kind of issue you had with the ride.
Yeah.
How do I
Brian,
direct-
may I interrupt just really quick?
Yeah.
Brian, could
Yeah.
you just re-raise your hand, because I inadvertently turned off your megaphone, and I want to be able to turn that back on for you. So if you just re-raise your hand, or if you're able to turn your megaphone on, I think the rest of the room will be able to hear you better. Sorry
I don't
about
know
that.
how to do the megaphone thing, but
I mean, I should be able to do it for you.
No, we can do the megaphone for you.
Okay, it should be on now. So sorry for the interruption, gentlemen.
so can everybody hear me better?
Yes.
There we go.
So my problem was the same you had with your ride. How do I
Yeah.
best in a VR
Right.
glasses? How do I could shoot the action
That.
with a
Yeah.
360 camera, but then
Yeah.
if I've got things
Yeah.
going on behind my user,
Yeah.
how do I get that done?
Yeah.
Have you guys
So-
heard any
I have.
about people doing that and it working
Yes.
that problem out?
I have, yes. And connect with me and we'll have an offline conversation. But just yesterday, actually, I was talking to a person, a young lady who directed a short 360-degree video. And the whole conversation was about how she directs that and what she learned about from the experience. It's what you're talking about. I think we're going to be seeing that. but there are definitely some really unique concerns. One of the questions was like, well, how do you hide like lighting rigs and stuff like that? And she was able to figure out how to light the scenes without having just using the natural lighting there. So it's definitely an emerging area, and I'd love to talk to you more about that for sure.
I'll look for you on LinkedIn, I guess. Brian Collins.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and
Zach. So
Cool.
perfect.
name. Look for that.
All right, we are
Gotcha.
just about out of time here. Is there anybody else in the room that has a question or would like to maybe comment or provide some feedback to Brian about the presentation today? I'd love to give anybody else an opportunity to do that before I kind of open up the microphones so that we could do a little socializing. Looks like I've got Dacky Duck. Must be one of our Disney lovers over here. So we're going to put Dacky Duck on air. Oh, Dacky, where'd you go? Looks like Dacky Duck showed up and then maybe got a little nervous to.
You got someone raising a hand up there.
Yeah, okay, let me go ahead and do that, Dacky. Yep. Okay, you should be good to go, Dacky Duck, if you want to ask Brian a question.
Yeah, it's just kind of a question read on in terms of obviously I'm sure everyone's sick of hearing about coronavirus, but going forward, like when they create these rides and the different immersive experiences, what sort of changes do you think there'll be on the rides now? Because I think a lot of people will be more kind of concerned, if you know what I mean. Kind of,
right.
What sort of changes do you think will happen in the rides?
Right.
They're planning these and engineering them going forward.
Excellent question. I think for right now, the best that they can do is try and adapt to social distancing measures, trying to keep people a little bit further apart. So, and then some of the stories and scenes, again, initially might be adjusted. So, for example, in the Haunted Mansion, if you've ever been in there, one of the very first experiences you do is everyone goes into the room with the stretch paintings, and they've been talking about, unfortunately, for right now, bypassing that, just having you walk through that scene and load into your vehicle. So I think initially you're going to just kind of see some Band-Aids being put out there. Whether or not there are best practices that they're able to adopt for new ride design, that's what's going to be really interesting to look at. Theme parks by their nature, they're not really designed to be socially distant, activities. When we go to a theme park, we like having people around us, and a lot of us do anyway, and experiencing that. This is really uncharted territory for the industry, like so many industries out there. And it's going to be really interesting to kind of see how they're able to adapt it. And some of it, again, may just come down to really kind of clever story writing, and kind of building that social distancing into the story. So,
all right, everybody, I think we're going to maybe just throw up one last round of support and love for Brian. I have released the stage blocker, so the room is open. The microphones are open right now as well. We are going to be here for a few minutes, hanging out and chatting. I encourage everybody that's joined us today to, say hello to each other. These events are always intended to stimulate conversation, and the conversation doesn't start and stop with these events. They continue throughout the day. They continue from world to world. If you're new to AltSpace VR, we ask you to meet a friend and go world hopping together.